Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill. I'm your host, Ramsey Nasser. As you know, this year we're focusing on sustainability in scholarly publishing, including the humanities and beyond. And today we get into the numbers with two of the industry's most distinguished leaders. Stay with us. So we have been asking what sustainability in scholarly publishing looks like, including a recent episode on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as we're fond of doing here, it's always clarifying to start with first principles. What does the data actually say? What can't the data tell us? In our digital era of superfluous data, what publishing data has potentially gone unharnessed? Of course, there's the backdrop of artificial intelligence and current political debates about DEI. And amidst all of this, the question, how exactly can publishing data help drive sustainability? To help us answer these questions and so much more about data and sustainability in scholarly publishing, we have the perfect guests. Dr. Michiel, Kolman, and Rachel Martin are authors of the article, What Can Data Tell Us About Publishing? How Data Can Potentially Drive Progress in Sustainability, which was published in 2023 in Logos, the Brill Journal of the World Publishing Community. Doctors Kolman and Martin, it is an honor to have both of you with us today.
We're delighted to be here. Thank you.
Very happy to be here.
So happy you're with us. Let's just jump right into it. What are the data sets that are currently available in the industry? Your article refers to an alliance between something called the International Publishers Association and the World Intellectual Property Office, or WIPO, as well as Nielsen and different trade associations. Am I missing any? What are the big sources of data on publishing and scholarly publishing in particular? To what degree are these data sets publicly available? How are they working together to expand data on publishing? And how are these data sets, which are available to us, evolving with all the new technologies? I know there's a lot of questions there, but what do we have to work with on the data front?
Shall I start maybe introducing the International Publishers Association, which is an umbrella organization of publishers associations around the world. So you might be in Spain. There is a dedicated publishers association for the Spanish publishers, and they are a member of the IPA. IPA is headquartered in Geneva, and it's actually next to WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is part of the UN and is there to protect copyright and to see that copyright is being up to date in this modern world. We, at the IPA, work together with WIPO, and we've been gathering data, and that's, I would say, more fundamental data about the books being published, which format, is it a print book, is it an online book. WIPO, as a UN organization, is a global organization, so is the IPA. So we have been gathering data from many, many countries, and that's also covered in our article in Logos. And for full disclosure, I was IPA president for 2 years, and now I chair at the IPA Inclusive Publishing and Literacy. And there we also have an interesting take on data, because in that committee we track literacy, accessibility, sustainability, diversity, and inclusion. And we kind of took a step back by not just getting all into the, I would say, this hardcore data, but there we look more about, if you look at a publishing house or a publishing organization, how mature are they on this topic? How mature are they, for instance, on accessibility or literacy? And maturity is then kind of defined like, oh, they just started, they have a committee, there is one person dedicated to kind of, laying the groundwork. And on the other side, if you're very mature, you have dedicated committee, you have a strategy, you have been implementing it, you've been tracking progress, you have been benchmark how well you're doing. And so that's kind of a different take on data. And we just did a survey, and we found that they're actually quite mature when you talk about literacy and also about educational aspects there. And not so mature, for instance, around sustainability and D&I, but diversity, equity, and inclusion is a little bit in the middle.
I think in terms of data in the publishing industry, it's good to think that the publishing industry, we're from the scholarly publishing sector of this, but it's also education and trade publishers. So there's a fair amount of data that can be collected, things like format, whether it's an audio book, whether it's a print book where it's actually bought. And all of those things are really useful context when you think about sustainability, when you start thinking about what changes need to happen, when we start thinking about our environmental impact or our climate impact, or when you start thinking about what you might want to track, as Michiel sort of said, in terms of diversity and inclusion. Traditionally, what you find is a lot of the markets, particularly trade and education, are going to be national based. If you're in Spain, you're going to be looking at a curriculum system which is Spanish. You're going to be looking at Spanish language books, things which would be talking about things that Spanish people want to read. So if that makes complete sense, I think in scholarly publishing, it's a little different. We're very global. Science language is English. It is incredibly digital rather than physical. And so these kind of characteristics are really useful for us. And scholarly publishers tend to be very data rich. We've got databases like Scopus and Web of Science. We can say how many articles get published each year. We can say how many were published in what journals, what subjects. We have really great, rich data. And that's all really, really important when we start thinking about those wider implications. And that's not necessarily the case all the way around the world when we think about things like trade publishing. There are countries which simply cannot tell you how many books were sold, or there are regions which, for reasons which make complete sense, they just don't have that data. There are others like the US and the UK, which are very data rich. They'll be able to tell you, what book was sold at what till in what bookstore. And that's amazing. That's really rich, incredible data. And I think the value of the IPA is to be able to collect some of those economic ones and to use that as a starting base. And those reports are publicly available. You can get them from the WIPO website. And I'm being really happy that from 2019 to about 2021, the STM, the scholarly publishing data, has also been included in that as well. So, there are some data sets out there. They're really useful. They give you a really good context about what is this sector, what are the dynamics, what are kind of some of the drivers.
And STM is scientific, technical, and help me out here.
Welcome to the jargon central publishing. Yes, indeed, and medical. But it also includes the humanities. I don't know why STM and everything has these acronyms, but yes, we are acronym heavy in this industry.
Yeah, just for the benefit of our wider listenership. I'm interested in that last comment that you made, which echoes something that you mentioned in the article. You wrote that there had been very little movement in a large number of years to expand the number of countries which are covered by publishing data sets beyond the global north, and that there's a bias in the data that's available to the global north. And your article was published, as we said, a couple years ago. Has there been any movement since then? Are there any prospects on that front on a forward basis?
Well, this is a structural problem, to be honest. And for the IPA, we take a global perspective. Our members are everywhere. So it's not only the UK or the US, but we have many members in Africa and in the global south, in Latin America. And those countries, it's already a bit difficult to be a publisher there, but let alone to gather all the right publishing information at the country level. So, and this is something on our agenda, but we're not going to solve this overnight, to be honest. And we see that even in Europe, I mean, there's better data in Europe, but it's more easy to get data in Western Europe than, for instance, in the new member states in Eastern Europe. So even there, we have to sometimes kind of extrapolate data to make like an educated guess.
I can't help myself, as you already mentioned, I am based in Madrid, Spain. Having two experts on the show, I can't resist but ask you about the Spanish exception, which you highlighted in your article. Across the WIPO database, 2/3 of sales are made by digital channels. But in Spain, almost 80% of publishing takes place in physical space. And unsurprisingly, and corresponding with that statistic, digital and audiobooks have less than 6% market share. Do you have any insight into what is driving this outlier status for Spain? And more generally, how do inter-country variations like these affect the sustainability agenda in publishing?
So let me take that. I think it's an awesome observation, and it definitely links to sustainability. So what we're talking about here is some of those economic or market kind of statistics and data. As you mentioned, Spanish sales, particularly in trade and education, are going to be in physical bookstores. That's not unusual for some of the other Southern European countries. We definitely find there is huge variation. I mean, if we think about format, I believe Malta, I think, is the least with 0.5% in terms of digital. I think Japan was the biggest with about 46%. So print in the trade and education space is definitely still here, and it's still here for many years to come. Now, if we want to make the link to sustainability, that's really interesting. Those market dynamics, that local context is super useful because a lot of our chains, supply chains tend to be national based, right? You want a book that's going to be sold in Spanish in Spain, and you need to think of those drivers. And that was one of the things that we did actually in a study for the flagship program called Book 2.0 in Portugal. So Portugal has a very similar market to Spain. And we decided that we were going to do something a little crazy. We're going to try and see if we can calculate the carbon footprint of the general Portuguese publishing market in 2023. And we used a lot of aggregations. It was very much a first stab of trying to put a number on the carbon impact. But what was more useful than actually having the number was to figure out what drivers were behind it. And things like where the book is sold means that you need to think back, how does the book go from the warehouse to the bookshop? Is that by electric vehicle or is it by, different cars? Is it by train? What are the kind of mechanisms behind it? And also to think about some of the policies and regulations that are put in place. Portugal, like many other countries, have a fixed book price where they don't compete on price for a certain amount of time. And that means that, independent bookstores have a chance against big sellers like Amazon. But it also means in terms of sustainability, if we think about it, that, books might be going to a bookshop, staying in the bookshop for a little bit longer, coming back to the warehouse, going back. And actually in Portugal, we estimated a book would go back and forth between warehouse and bookshop about 4 to 5 times. Obviously more after the fixed book price had expired. So again, thinking through demand, printing on demand, what kind of behaviors can we incentivize was really useful. And to do that, we had to have that context where you're looking at those national market dynamics, thinking about those local supply chains, thinking about the possible carbon impact, and then thinking through how collectively the industry might be able to think through some really concrete actions that might help to reduce their carbon footprint. So you get the idea that these data might seem sort of interesting or might seem a little bit abstract to the sustainability side, but actually is quite fundamental to help us think through where we're going to have the most impact and which part of the supply chain might we need to be thinking about working with.
Your article argued that, quote, almost most data and statistics focus on the sector's economic contribution, but there is an opportunity to also think through the ways a better understanding of international publishing could drive decisions on sustainability, end quote. What precisely is the connection between data specifically and sustainability in the publishing space?
So I think it'd be interesting to take a step back. I think what you can measure, you can change. And sustainability means different things to different people. You can talk to somebody and the word sustainability might mean ESG. We talked about acronyms, ESG, we have SDG. We have them all in sustainability as well. Obviously some people might think of sustainability through the lens of environmental impact or carbon or climate change. Other people will think about it in terms of diversity and inclusion. So the idea that data helps us define what we mean is super important. We started the podcast thinking about that definitions and data really matters. This is so true in sustainability. It is an abstract concept to think about, how do we preserve today's resources for future generations? How do we make sure we don't exceed our planetary boundaries? that is all really big picture. And when you kind of break it down to data, you can actually think of, okay, what do we mean if we say diversity and inclusion? Michiel already mentioned, are we thinking about how many authors are from different, parts of our society? Are we thinking about editorial board inclusion here? Are we talking about... So as soon as you put a measure on something, you then create a benchmark, and then we can actually see how we track that over time. And so I think explicitly it is around definitions. What do we mean by different things? And also it's really around, how do we as an industry kind of define success? What does progress look like? Michiel had the really great examples that if you're a national publishers association, it could be having a commitment, or it could be around, putting some actions in place, maybe sharing best practice. All of those are all equally as useful as kind of coming up with a carbon number. But figuring out which data we use, how do we measure it, that's a collective conversation, which I think sort of started a few years under Michiel's leadership at the IPA, and it is continuing. There isn't an easy answer here. But Michiel, maybe you have a thought here.
Yes, well, I should also definitely mention that the IPAs were working very closely with the UN, and we launched what is called the SDG Publishers Compact. So where we ask publishers and publishing organizations to kind of commit to supporting to the SDGs, but it's actually then specified in 10 very concrete steps they have to take. And it's something that a publishing organization can actually start doing tomorrow. So they're not like, you have to be carbon neutral by 2040. No, it's like you must have a dedicated committee. You must have a budget. You must use it in your strategy. You must use it internally, externally. You must focus on some of the SDGs. So it's very powerful. And this really resonated well. So we've seen, I think, in a short time, almost 400 organizations signed up for the SDG Publishers Compact. And many actually are SDN publishers, like the Gruyter Brill, for instance. So I'm very happy that this resonated so well. It hit the spot, so to say, because it kind of solves the problem like, the SDGs are complicated. There are 17, and under that there are 160 something steps you have to take. I don't know where to start. Let's do nothing. And this is like, no, you signed a compact, and there are 10 things, and you can start tomorrow.
Amazing. Yeah, one of the topics which is coming up and in terms of measurement and sustainability is diversity and pluralism, which are important parts of sustainability. But in some countries around the world, most recently especially, questions of diversity and pluralism have been increasingly contested. Particularly we see in the United States in recent weeks. Does any publishing data exist that illuminate the connections between diversity and sustainability in academia?
I think it's a really interesting question, and there's definitely some ways that we could be thinking about sort of diversity's role within sustainability. And I think, as Michiel kind of mentioned, the Sustainable Development Goals have really been a useful framework, mainly because it is the only international framework that sort of goes across all industries, all sectors, not just publishing, but you're talking about energy, you're talking about infrastructure. And it's also where all of the UN member states signed up to thinking about, hey, this is the direction of travel. And I think what's interesting there is that there's obviously some of the SDGs which are directly related to diversity, of course, gender equality, reducing inequalities. But you find that because they're interlinked, any progress made on one, such as climate action, kind of has to, also address some of the diversity parts, such as gender equality. We need women to be going in and getting an education if we want them to participate in society, reduce zero hunger, and, then have the education and the tools available to address climate change. So, that kind of framework is a really useful way of thinking about diversity and sustainability. And I think if you zoom into the academia space, what I hear, at least when I go out and I talk to universities and I talk to the sustainability leads within universities, is that SDG number 17, partnerships for the goals, is incredibly important because, diversity is not just about, as we've seen in America, the definition of sort of DEI. Diversity and achieving sustainability or sustainable development really kind of also it goes to the core of kind of inter and transdisciplinarity within academics. So thinking about, if we're going to have a solution for a new train or a public transport infrastructure within our cities, we need to be thinking about what's the impact on local people. Who's going to be more advantaged? Who's going to be disadvantaged? It's making sure that the engineers, the architects are thinking through sustainability in a much more holistic way. And that's why we start seeing a lot of the universities implementing, sustainability, introduction courses where you get engineering. It's not just about, hey, here's the basics of engineering. It's also, hey, let's also think about the sustainability angles of it. And I definitely hear from universities that their students are asking about it. They don't want to be taught from textbooks from 10, even 15 years ago, right? This is about what does it mean in today's world? What do we need to be thinking about? And there I feel like, there is a wider conversation about how do we get more collaboration? How do we get more diverse perspectives on these really complex challenges? So that's kind of my take on it. But Michiel, I'm sure, had the perspective.
Yeah, well, what I find very interesting, and I leave the political, I would say, situation aside for the time being, because this is an ongoing discussion already for many, many years, is a different evaluation of what is good research, and also by implication, what is a good researcher, right? And that's of course core questions. And traditionally, academia has chosen to evaluate research and researchers by looking at articles and citations. And they realized this is too narrow and we have to move away from it. And I find, for instance, COARA, it's a European-led but international kind of review of research. So the evaluation of research, a very interesting initiative. And what I hear there is, so maybe research is not only being evaluated how many times it's cited by other researchers. Maybe we should kind of broaden this whole kind of evaluation. What is the impact of research, for instance, on policy? What is the impact, for instance, on society? And that you can measure with bibliometrics, but you can also measure it with other ways, anecdotal information, etc. And that also relates, of course, to the question, how do you evaluate individual researchers? I now actually happen to be in Amsterdam. In the Netherlands, we've had a long discussion about rewards and recognition of research. And it's moving researchers, it's moving away from counting articles and citations. And it's far more is like, what do you contribute in an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary research environment? What do you contribute to society? What do you contribute to your university? For instance, if you are the dean or do other services for the university itself. What do you contribute for education? It's crucial, of course, right? Education at universities. But traditionally, researchers have been more evaluated by what they do on the research side than on the educational side. So I find that very refreshing. And of course, that also, when you talk about societal impact or what is the impact on the SDGs, it's completely linked, right, with sustainability. And we see that, for instance, in bibliometrics, we can kind of map out which research really has direct impact on which SDG. And that, of course, is now servicing much more in also the evaluation of researchers and research itself.
Fantastic. In our recent episode, our first episode at Sustainability Matters with Dr. Namisha Barton, we explored the limits of inclusion in academic context. So picking up on that, I suppose I want to ask you, what are the limits of data on diversity, equity, and inclusion in higher education? Do we know anything about the areas where it has been the most successful in driving outcomes compared to other areas where perhaps it's been less successful? Has data been a big driver for promoting DEI, or does it have some limits on what it can do?
Yes, I mean, I find it a fascinating question. I am very much involved in DEI and also not only in academia, but also more in the corporate world. And I actually see that the corporates are a little bit more advanced than academia for whatever reason. So a typical multinational that has decided we're going to put diversity and inclusion on the agenda, they can move maybe because of their structure a little bit faster than a university, which has a more distributed power structure. And we see that multinationals have, for instance, mapped out and know exactly based on data how diverse they are. They know it on many different dimensions of diversity, whether it's around gender, race, ethnicity, LGBTIQ plus, disability, etc., etc. And once you have that input, you can then also kind of assess, are we doing well or good enough? And if not, can we kind of correct the situation? So it could be, if you run a multinational, that things are going really well in Germany, but not so much in Spain. So you can then kind of correct that situation over time. Universities are on the data gathering part a little bit behind. And often you also hear like, ooh, gathering data around, race and ethnicity, that's very sensitive. Or what is the definition of race and ethnicity? Or around LGBTIQ plus, is that kind of personal data? Is not. So there's this all kind of hesitation at universities. We do have pretty good data around gender. Of course, that is legally kind of gathered, but there are also big studies. The EU gathers great data. Researchers themselves gather good data. And also elsewhere, we contribute with gender studies almost on a biannual basis. And there we see progress. But still, if you look at kind of reaching kind of level of parity, so say more than 40% women, there is still some improvement to be made, and it depends very much, I think, on the country you're talking about. So in Portugal or in Brazil, there is really gender parity. But there are other countries like Japan or Germany which are still far behind. We see progress there, but it's progress starting from a very, very low level. And that's really kind of, challenges. Like, you have so much talent there, right? All these female scientists somehow are dropping out or not making it into the system in Japan or in Germany. So that is something that, it screams opportunity coming.
And maybe just to add, I mean, one of the limitations I think with data is that it is just data. It's a number. It doesn't give you that full context of what it means. I mean, we're talking about diversity data. We're not talking about the feeling of inclusion or psychological safety within teams or within the universities, or being able to, within an organization, feel like you are yourself and you can come and present your best self at work. So there's definitely some limitations about what data. It's a good starting point to measure and to track, but there's a lot to be thinking about in terms of the story we want to say about this. I mean, I never forget one of the meetings we had, and there was a female panelist, and she was saying, yeah, I keep getting a lapel mic. She says, I don't wear blazers. We're not males, right? Even those little tiny details, for me, that's about, making sure that you can come to, work, you can feel, safe in going to the toilet, whether it's a gender neutral one or whatever. Those small things do make a difference. And so I do think, the data is a first, perhaps, starting point, but it's not the end point. It's not the destination. This isn't target setting. This is really around, are we driving measurable outcomes? But more importantly, are we having, a really productive and happy and purposeful, people who come to work every day and feel very comfortable? And at the end of the day, that's what we want, right? We want healthy, happy societies.
Fair enough. So there are obviously many elements to a broader sustainability agenda, which we've been discussing, including DEI, but also environmental and other issues broadly captured by the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development. Across all of this range of elements, across the entire sustainability agenda, where does data have the most potential to deliver impact?
Well, I mean, if we think about the SDG framework, the framework has 17 broad goals, and sometimes you can get wrapped up because they're beautiful colors and you can put them on a nice pin. But underlying that is 169 very, very specific targets. So, even at the UN level, they're really tracking things like, maternal mortality rates. They're tracking things like literacy. They are tracking things like, trying to eradicate AIDS or tuberculosis and measuring those cases. So definitely, if we're thinking about the SDGs, if we're thinking about that as a framework, those broad aspirations for zero hunger or climate action are a starting point. But much like Michiel sort of mentioned, when we start thinking about, okay, how do we actually contribute to it? There are 169 very specific targets that are agreed across the UN countries to really move the needle. And I think the challenge for academics is to think through, their research about how do they actually contribute to that? How do they, feel their research might be thinking about those broad themes, but more importantly, those individual targets. And a great case example that I can think of is the Lancet and their commissions. They took the SDGs related to SDG number 3, good health and well-being, and commissioned new research to look at those gaps. So you can definitely see that this isn't just about a nice comms pamphlet or a nice web page that goes up on a company or a university site. This is really around driving, okay, where are some of the knowledge gaps? How journals, how do we kind of move in there? And it's not just about, medical sciences. We need the humanities as well. We need them to understand what is the impact of AI on society. Is that going to increase or decrease the inequalities that we see? So, everybody can play their part in the content side as well. And I think that sometimes gets overlooked when we're, looking at nice colored boxes on a screen.
And what about broader learnings about the employment of data across different sectors? We've been speaking about transdisciplinarity earlier. Has data gathering and application publishing been able to learn from the data gathering and application in other fields? Are there broader sector transferable lessons?
So maybe I can address it a little bit if we focus just on the publishing industry. So there we see, and in certain countries like the UK and the US as well, they have started gathering key data around diversity and inclusion and link that to a strategic objective. And I think I'm quite impressed actually. So we are now already at the second strategic plan in the UK. The first one was launched maybe like 8 years ago, and they said for the next 5 years we're going to have these clear objectives. And one of them was on an annual basis gathering great data on all the dimensions of diversity in the UK publishing industry. And then track, of course, progress. And they also set goals. So, for instance, they wanted around gender. They want gender parity at the executive level and also at the senior director level. Overall in the UK publishing industry, that was supposed to be achieved in 5 years, but it was exactly achieved in 3 years. So a great success. Doesn't mean that it's going really well for all dimensions of diversity. Not so much. Take, for instance, race and ethnicity. The publishing industry is actually quite a wide industry, and it's very difficult to attract, say, non-white folk to join. There were specific training programs, and people started. And that is kind of tying back to what Rachel mentioned earlier. Kind of data says one thing, but in fact, you want a sense of belonging. You want people to feel really that they are welcomed and are part of the organization. And it turns out that it's difficult if you're a young Black woman and you join an organization, and I generalize a little bit, which is more or less run by white women of a certain age. There's a quite disconnect there, so to say. And so that's something that the UK publishing industry is working on. But I salute them that they have the right data and they deploy it in the right way, and we see that that we have progress over time.
And maybe to think of like extra sort of sectors, the SDG Publishers Compact is for the publishing organizations. But there are other compacts. There's compact for football associations. There's compacts for advertising and media organizations. And what we found is that actually publishing is doing a pretty good job. Everybody's signing up. Everybody sees that it's important. Everybody's going back and really thinking through those 10 concrete steps and, finding out, okay, yeah, we're going to prioritize, these FGGs, and we feel like we're going to make this step. So we definitely see that, cross-sector things like the SDG framework enable us to have some comparison. There's also, things like the benchmarks that happen within DEI. So I know there's a workplace pride monitor, for example. There's also various ones around gender equality, which tend to be, sector non-specific, but it does give you a score. Same with the rating agencies for ESG. They're going through and they're looking at your, HR policies. They're looking at your, your compliance, your regulatory side. And those also give us a really good benchmark on, okay, how are we doing as an organization? Now, I know within university, there's a thing called the Athena Swan, which, gives you a similar kind of thing, a gold, silver, and bronze kind of idea of where do you sit. And all of those, I think, are really useful because, as great as it is to think about our own sector, sometimes it's also good to have a look at lessons being learned elsewhere, particularly over things which are really hard to implement. I'm sure Michiel can talk about self-ID, where, how do you collect that information? Who does that better? And, there we look to different sectors.
Indeed. So self-ID takes on the different dimension of diversity. And I kind of alluded to it already before. There are some dimensions which are considered controversial. But I mean, organizations succeed on getting the data, especially multinationals. They have data around, say, race and ethnicity worldwide, around LGBTIQ plus worldwide. Sometimes it takes some negotiations with the lawyers, with the workers' councils, etc. But you can gather all that data. In academia, this is still kind of considered very difficult. So yeah, we don't know how many black, professors in chemistry there are in the Netherlands. This is, and then of course you don't know if there are enough black professors in chemistry, or this is something you should address all the time or not. Let alone like if you interview them and say, how do you feel as probably the only black person in the faculty? So yeah, data is a very interesting point there.
It's becoming increasingly difficult to ignore the massive pushback against diversity, equity, inclusion in the United States right now. Is there a future for DEI and indeed for sustainability more broadly as social, cultural, political projects? Or are we witnessing the beginning of the end of these projects?
I don't think we should buy into this narrative, which is kind of forced upon us by some, I would say, more right radical politicians. I think we should double down on our efforts, all the diversity, equity, and inclusion. What we see is that the underlying kind of business case is still as valid as it is. And also the moral imperative that you want everybody to feel included, in the workplace, is also still as valid as ever before. Of course, yes, we see there are political changes and it does affect especially public organizations, so also therefore universities. But it's certainly not the case that there is no DEI anymore. All companies have kind of yielded to the pressure from the White House. If you look at the Fortune 500 companies, there are still hundreds of companies who are staying the course. Or they're kind of fine-tuning. Maybe they are not so much talking about diversity because that's kind of linked with quotas. They talk much more about inclusion and belonging. And I think that's the right way to do it. So I really hope that we invest even more in diversity, equity, and inclusion than ever before.
And I think I have to agree with Michiel. It's not a choice for sustainability anymore. I mean, we're talking about, research, we're talking about scientists. For the past 40 years, they have got a very clear case that climate change is happening, it's accelerating, sustainability needs to happen. We need DEI alongside our sustainability efforts if we are going to have an inhabitable planet. We've only got one planet. So it isn't a choice of yes or no. I think what we're starting to see is a bit of a pushback because, these are really complex problems. Climate change is not something that's solved overnight. It's certainly not solved by one discipline, and it's certainly not solved by one technology. What we're asking is every part of society to change, and change is hard. And part of change management is a bit of blowback. And, I like to think that this is a little bit of noise, which is happening, but you already see it in terms of the energy transition. I was really happy to read in South Africa, for example, where, energy, just being able to get reliable energy is an issue. They're really embracing solar, they're embracing wind, they're embracing renewable energy. The train is going, and, we need to hold the course. And I think, there isn't really a choice about, do we do this, or is it going to collapse? It is just where it's going to happen. And we need to be able to feel strong and empowered, to feel the uncomfortableness, if that's the word, right now, because the path is going to be better. And I think we have to be thinking positively and optimistically.
Fantastic. Last question, talking about the other hot topic of our time. Is there any risk that widespread uptake of artificial intelligence could affect the fidelity of data in scholarly publishing? What are the prospects, and conversely, what are the prospects for large language models to improve data work in the areas that we've been discussing?
Big picture, artificial intelligence, broadly, huge potential. And we definitely see that happening. We've got data centers, which we know are going to be sources of energy use. And that means that we need to be able to run them efficiently. And we're already seeing large language models helping them do that more efficiently. We're seeing, these models being able to help us think through some of the challenges. So in terms of environment, in terms of carbon, we definitely see that this is going to be something that should be very useful and make us more efficient. I will say that we're also very conscious of the digital divide here. There's definitely going to be, with any new technology, those who can afford to do it and those who can't. And that's why I think, things like DeepSeek, which, proves that things are moving rapidly in terms of greater accessibility, is really important. And it's just something that we're going to hopefully be able to utilize, and we should be able to utilize. Back to our previous comment of holding the line, we should be able to be thinking about this in a really positive way, baking in sustainability right now. So we know that these models, are not going to exacerbate, existing inequalities in terms of how they're designed, but also how they operate as well.
Yeah, make it take a step back. So AI, super exciting development. But in the core, of course, is the data that's being used by AI. And I think publishers are at a very fortunate, privileged position, because they sit on so much trustworthy, reliable data. So AI applications have come out of the publishing industry, come out of STM, for instance, where they combine the AI technology with trustworthy, reliable information is I think, the way to go. And yeah, you move away from all the other discussions then about, AI, it's hallucinating, or you cannot trust this, because you control, the trustworthiness of the data that is being used there. So for me, AI and publishing is like a perfect combination for success.
And it's been reassuring to see even the summit in Paris just recently. They're already committing to a regulatory framework which is baking in some of these core themes and thinking through how to harness the technology in a responsible way, right?
Fantastic. And on that optimistic note, I will thank both of you for this extremely insightful conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today. That was Dr. Michiel Kolman and Rachel Martin. And this has been Sustainability Matters. As always, you can participate. Tell us what you think of the Sustainability Matters podcast. If you would like us to cover any specific topics in this format in future episodes, or if you have thoughts about data and sustainability in publishing that you would like us to take up, write to us and let us know. We're at podcast@brill.com, and we would love to hear from you. If enough of you write to us about data and sustainability in publishing, or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in another episode. For now, I will say thank you, as always, for being with us. I'm your host, Ramsey Nasser. See you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.